Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to kickstart this webinar series on transformation. This series of transformation webinars are being led by the College of Humanities. My name is UKZN. I would like to welcome you all. I want to welcome in a very, very special way the Dean and Head of School, Professor Hlongwa, all the members of the college leadership who are here, as well as our keynote speakers today who have taken time from their busy schedules to share their wisdom on this important topic on the transformation of higher education, especially with reference to decoloniality. A lot of changes have taken place in the higher education center, but a number of questions remain. Questions such as, have we really transformed the institutional culture of institutions such that it is able to accommodate all our students and academics? Have we transformed what one could call the geography and gender of thought, which are very, very important considerations, not only in the South African context, but also in the Southern Hemisphere as a whole. So with those background words, I want again to kickstart this webinar series on transformation, and we are looking forward to an excellent engagement with our panelists today. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mkhize. Will you please bring in Professor Hlongwa as our facilitator?
Thank you very much, Chair. At this point, I would like to call upon Professor Hlongwa, who is a member of the College Management Committee and the Dean and Head of the School of the Arts, to lead us this afternoon as our facilitator. Thank you very much, Professor Washington, for guiding us accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mkhize. Thank you very much, our colleagues. I do want to greet all our colleagues at a local as well as at an international level who were able to join us this afternoon as we engage on this important topic, on this important dialogue, when we dialogue on issues of racism, on issues on racism in South African higher education at this important time, which is the decolonial moment. At this time, I would like to introduce Professor Salim Washington. Professor Salim Washington is a composer and instrumentalist. He performs on the flute, saxophone, and bass clarinet. He has also studied other instruments, including mbira and hand drums. Prof. Washington is also a scholar and educator and teaches at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa. His musical background is in jazz and other African-American vernacular musics. But he relishes collaborations within and between different genres of music and has performed and recorded with the progressive musicians in various contexts. His aesthetic is rooted in tradition, but his performance practices embrace the avant-garde and the experimental as well. As an instrumentalist and as a composer, he has recorded and performed in clubs, in concerts, in halls, and festivals throughout the United States, in Canada, in Mexico, Brazil, Cuba, South Africa, Mozambique, and various countries in Europe with many leading figures in jazz. With those few words, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Professor Salim Washington. Over to you, Prof.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Slongwa. I appreciate it. It is my honor to introduce our three panelists, and we have very dynamic and brilliant panelists, and we are in for an engaging process here. First, let me start with Professor Tendai Sitole, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of South Africa. His scholarly interests include political theory, decoloniality, jazz and politics, and Black aesthetics. He is the author of Steve Biko, Decolonial Meditations of Black Consciousness, and also The Black Register. Um, Professor Sitole is one of the most engaging minds that I've had the privilege of being around. And what I think makes him particularly good for this webinar is that in addition to his brilliance, he's also committed to the emancipation of Black people. He's also committed to the emancipation of working people. When I first met him, he was coming up to advise a student in prison, in fact. And so I think uh, we'll have much to learn from Professor Sitole. Also, we have Professor Robin D.J. Kelly, who is the Gary B. Nash Professor of American History at the University of California in Los Angeles. He is, of course, one of the leading historians in the United States, and according to Cornel West, the singularly leading historian of the Black working class. Despite the American focus, I found out that he does have a master's in African history, and we are depending upon him to offer an international perspective. We find that the problems that are plaguing us with respect to racism are not unique to us in all aspects and all regards. And so we find his presence also very valuable. He's the author of Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class. He also wrote Your Mama's Dysfunctional, about the cultural wars. Africa Speaks, America Listens, Modern Jazz and Revolutionary Times. And he has changed the historiography of jazz by writing the most authoritative biography of the great Thelonious Monk. So we welcome him as well. We have yet another brilliant person who is Ongezwa Mbele. She is a lecturer in drama and performance studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Her work is in applied theater. She's an applied theater practitioner. She's a storyteller and a poet. And in her work, she tries to engage diverse communities in terms of trying to deal with the problems that they identify. Currently, her interest is in township youth culture and violence, and exploring the ways in which applied theater can be a tool of social and political transformation. So we have three brilliant and apt panelists. We're going to start with Professor Sitole, please. So we ask you to come at this time and present to us for 20 minutes, please.
Thanks, Professor Washington, and thanks for Ms. Zulu, who has been sending emails back and forth. And all of you, I hope that I will live up to the task in relation to the humbling introduction. I'm just going to give a telegraphic engagement in relation to this big theme. for this webinar. And I would humbly want to title it a critique of gratefulness, subtitled on the scandal of epistemic racism. And I want to give this telegraphic thoughts in relation to the context of South African institutions of higher learning, but particularly what I will call white liberal universities, of which University of KwaZulu-Natal has been one. And insofar as my experience is concerned, these white liberal institutions, as they were historically constructed, they operate on this banality of gratefulness, in which Black students from their formative undergraduate right through their PhDs, they are told that they must be grateful to be in those institutions, as if those institutions were not built on the sweat, blood, and tears of Black people, more especially at this moment when the call for decolonization or the installation of the epistemic project that is called decoloniality has been foregrounded. Addedly so, if like one can think about the contemporary history of Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, which has been very unique in the post-1994, in which student politics, they've been galvanized on the question of epistemic justice, and also having to confront epistemic racism, which is still being perpetuated at this moment in a very disturbing fashion. And I want to preface to say that recently we are seeing an upsurge and a prolific throughput race where there is a deliberate distortion of the project of decoloniality, in which the name decoloniality or the concept, they are just being bandied around. And there is also this climate of political correctness, where like, we are hearing that no, we are all for decoloniality, or we are all for decolonization, but at the same time you are finding the dissimulation of epistemic racism happening in ways that are very, very disturbing. And this is happening at the university space, which is supposed to be a contested space, and nobody is saying that decoloniality is the right way of knowing, thinking, and doing, but it's a form of a critical attitude that is building in relation to other communities of thought. And what has been foregrounded in the decolonial project has been a question of one having to account for the epistemic location through where one is speaking. And the Black lived experience, which has been erased and distorted throughout the long history of South Africa, is a force that now cannot be avoided. And the project of appropriating such discursive or epistemic interventions is happening in ways that are more violent and more condescending, in a sense that we are finding an attitude where when like black students or even black scholars, if like I might say, they will be told that if you study Frantz Fanon, he is archaic, he is irrelevant, or he is dead. But you are fed with the old canons which are still being taught at the university. And if maybe there is a take up or the push of the Black radical tradition as a long tradition, which has a very, very rich and diverse history, genealogy, we also receive that how is this scholarship, this is activism, it has nothing to do with enriching the culture of scholarship. And you find that the dismissal or this ad hominem criticism, it comes from a place which I would call epistemic deafness, epistemic arrogance, and epistemic ignorance, and which are the constitutional constitutive elements of epistemic racism. And the perversity of this culture, it's happening as if there is nothing that can be called a decolonial moment. And I want to argue and to put some pressure on the concept of this decolonial moment. That is this moment episodic? Is this moment something that is utopic, or is this moment something that is there to scandalize? And I want to caution against the danger of not taking this decolonial time not seriously of what it will do. And we know what happened during 1995 when the debates on transformation in the institutions of higher learning took place, that it was only a debate that happened for 3 years, and the language, it was only that of transformation, but there was no attendance to the epistemic questions and also the infrastructural critique on how the university is constituted, what is being taught, and how is that disseminated. And what we found was that there was the absence of the Black intelligentsia in the university, more especially at the epistemic and discursive side. And the danger that I want to highlight is that of allowing the liberal consensus to appropriate and to bastardize the decolonial project. We are seeing the proliferation of books that are coming out. There was a book on decolonizing the university by the almighty Professor Jonathan Ensign, whom I've been calling for a debate, and that has not been happening. That how do they use the decolonial language, but yet at the same time, they're the people who are protecting the status quo. And at the same time, you are finding that there is the push for just, it is like decolonize this, decolonize that, decolonize this, decolonize that. But there is no fundamental change that is being pushed forth. So I think what can rescue or remedy the situation in terms of highlighting this danger, I want to propose that a conceptual distinction should be made between cosmetic change, right? Which, of course, it comes with the theme of this webinar, Beyond the Rainbow, right? As if there was a rainbow before, because South Africa has never had any rainbow at any moment. We know that 1994, it was just a cosmetic and orgasmic affair, and nothing happened after that. We just saw cosmetic change. And in relation to cosmetic change, there will be a rhetoric of change, but not the reality of change. That is why, like the universities, they've been finding themselves insofar as the project of transformations have been introduced. There will be backlashes, there will be exhaustion, there will be a fight amongst the Black scholars for relevancy or stardom, right? So I want to call for fundamental change. And when I'm saying fundamental change, we know that the racist infrastructure is very deep in our universities. It does not happen at the episodic level. And I, for one, like in my commitment, it has been a struggle, and it continues. And this is what has been motivating me, like my fellow panelists, like they've told me about their academic journeys, and that has inspired me to push for fundamental change. Because if there is a fundamental change, we will be able to diagnose what fundamentally is racism. And unfortunately, in South Africa, we have the conceptual poverty of understanding what is racism. And as you know, that 2 years ago, FW de Klerk complained that he's a victim of racism, right? Everybody is complaining that like they are the victims of racism. And racism is not reduced to an event or an incident, right? And it must be distinguished from discrimination or prejudice, but it is a structural issue that must be uprooted. And for us to understand it, we have to understand what fundamentally is South Africa. What fundamentally is South Africa is as a polity, or which I will say a politically organized community. And when I'm saying a politically organized community, we will be able to know the logics that are there, that are governing this racial formation that is called South Africa. Because South Africa is a racial formation, which 1994 did not change anything. Yes, we have the black regime, right, in 27 years, but we are still finding that students, they cannot research on topics that are coming from their lived experiences. We know that academics cannot write books or publish journal articles, even book chapters that are coming from their lived experiences. But what is happening now is that they must come through this colored language that is being fabricated in the language of decoloniality, whereas that is not colonial. And I want us to pay attention to this pandemic called liberal decolonization. Liberal decolonization, it has nothing to do with the colonial, the colonial project. It has nothing to do with it. It is just there to fabricate the critical project that is threatening the hegemony that has been governing the curriculum infrastructure of the university. And South Africa is a racial formation. I want us to understand it in this way. And I would like to apologize for my conceptual formulation, but I think it is apt, at least insofar as I'm engaged in the historiography of South Africa as a country that is built on conquest, that is built on dispossession, and that is also built on dehumanization. So South Africa should be understood as the racist, settler, colonialist, segregationist, apartheid, non-racial apparatus. I repeat, it is the racist, settler, colonialist, segregationist, apartheid, non-racial apparatus. So in that formation, there's a hyphen between those words. It is not that I'm just giving you a conceptual formulation that is complex, but to understand the longue durée of this infrastructure of racism. And that is where the decoloniality comes as a critical project to unpack and to even unmask it, because for us to understand decoloniality, we have to understand coloniality. And coloniality, I will define it as the continuity of the colonial infrastructure, even if the colonial administration has left. So if we can think in that longue durée, we will have to understand that, yes, there are changes, right? That South Africa will change in many forms, but what changes is not the root of this infrastructure, but only its face. That is why we have to understand the difference between fundamental change and a cosmetic change. And unfortunately, if we are serious in having to understand the issue of anti-Black racism, insofar as the epistemic racism is concerned, insofar as the universities they are continuing to be, we have to reach out for the decolonial project. Of course, it is not a singular affair. It is not the only project. There are many other projects. But if we are concerned about transformation as putting Black people or having Black authors, without having to change the discursive arrangement, we are going to be dealing with cosmetic change. And this is where liberal decolonization gains traction. So what in this brief contribution that I will make is that we need the curriculum, right? I'm not pushing for this Africanization agenda, which does not see Africa in conversation with the world. Like, the world is a very complex place, and even if when you read the longue durée of African kingdoms, or the anthropology of Africa, it has been something that has been in conversation with the world, right? But this nationalistic element that is built on cultural chauvinism is, and then it is called in the name of Africanization, is what needs to be checked as well, because I don't see the decolonial project prospering in xenophobia. I don't see it prospering in patriarchy. I don't see it prospering in the provincialist ways of thinking. There is a need to generate and also to revitalize concepts, and even to read even these Western thinkers, right? Some of which we are calling racist, with other attitudes, so that we can be generative in the conversations, and also to step away from this culture of criticizing things without having to engage them thoroughly, because this is what will hamper this project of a critical mode of study. With that, I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Sithole. We appreciate your comments, and we will be engaging with your ideas shortly. So at this time, please Can we have Professor Kelly address us?
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here with these great panelists, with Professor Sithole, with Professor Mbele, with Professor Washington, everyone. And I should say a couple things first. Thank you to the organizers for putting this together. It's very hard to go after my brilliant colleague, Professor Sithole, who I always learn from every minute. And he always has the best analysis. And by the way, his conclusion is now my conclusion. So I don't have to repeat it. No. But that said, while I appreciate the invitation from my longtime friend, Professor Washington, I'm not sure if my insights will be useful, but I'm going to do the best I can. You know, I've studied and written a bit on South African history and have close comrades there. And like anyone working in the field of Black studies, South Africa continues to play a really central role in our global understanding of the Black condition. And still, there's so many ins and outs and dynamics of South African institutions that I'm not privy to. However, one of my arguments is that the kind of liberal form of decolonization or liberal multiculturalism that has dominated much of the debate or the co-optation of the decolonial moment is not limited to South Africa, but is actually global. And especially in my settler colonial nation. We'll get to that in a second. But let me just begin by acknowledging the obvious. That is that the formal collapse of the apartheid regime obviously did not end racism in South Africa, just as the end of formal Jim Crow segregation in the U.S. did not end racism in the U.S., not by a long shot. And by racism, just to repeat what Professor Sithole said, we're not talking about individual prejudice. We're talking about forms of structural institutional racism. And sometimes they get collapsed. I mean, racism persists as anti-Blackness as well as xenophobia. And I think that we often believe that from our perch, from the universities, that somehow we're like transcendent. We're supposed to be immune to these problems and questions, when in fact, the university is where racism, racist knowledge is produced, was produced, continues to be produced. I mean, universities, we sometimes believe are supposed to be engines of social change, where enlightened intellectuals create theories designed to critique and dismantle racism, or worse, teach tolerance, which itself is a form of racism, and we can get to that. But obviously this can't be true, because the most vibrant anti-racist movements in South Africa erupted in and against the university in the form of Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. This can't be true in a system where just recently 2/3 of university professors in South Africa were white. And, besides the quote, UCT's Kolele Manku, he says, no institution has done more than the modern university to create scientific racism. He also said it has become hard for Black people to call racism by its name at the liberal universities. And he talks about what he calls cultural racism, the shift from scientific to cultural racism. And what he calls modern cultural racism at the university relies on plausible deniability, which is to say, and I quote, when someone in your department insults you with a smile and still calls you an esteemed colleague, it happens when you call them out for racism and they pretend to be shocked and accuse you of being overly sensitive. But if you stand your ground, then they call you racist for calling them racist. And in the end, you get this kind of moral equivalence. Now, there's no shortage of scholarship, journalism, reports, investigations proving the persistence of racism, specifically anti-Blackness at the university. And of course, Professor Sithole just confirmed this. And what's ironic is, of course, you can read your own colleague, Sipiwe Motlong, who just 2 years ago produced a very fine thesis on the subject called Analysis of Race and Racism Discourse by Academics in Post-Apartheid Higher Education, which is about the University of KwaZulu. And, when you think about KwaZulu-Natal, you think about the fact that in her research, she interviewed academics, and she found that academics speak about race and racism in a deracialized manner, in ways that are ambivalent and contradictory, that minimize racism, that try to universalize claims that everyone is a victim and everyone therefore is a perpetrator of racism. Or in many cases, just simply blatantly deny the existence of race and racism. So to be clear, the denial of racism doesn't just come from the right. There are some Marxists in South Africa and elsewhere who argue that race thinking or any acknowledgement of race merely reproduces the old apartheid categories and therefore perpetuates apartheid. And they insist on doing away with race categories that would hasten the end of racism. And this is what would happen if you just don't talk about race. Racism, this is the way to get rid of racism. So they supported the elimination of affirmative action policies or race as a factor in admissions or hiring faculty. And of course, this placed them in opposition to some of the decolonial protests like Fees Must Fall and Rose Must Fall. And by the way, I know that part of this conversation has to do with performing arts. And one of the big myths around the history of performing arts, music, theater, is the fact that somehow performing artists have transcended race or racism. And that there's a lot of myths about like Dorke House and the interracial underground spaces of mixing and possible subversion. And so therefore artists are the vanguard. When in fact, whatever mixing took place, it did not change the power relationships at all. And so, the problems that, throughout the kind of high period of subversive non-racial cultural production, power relationships remain the same. But let me step back for a minute and start with some definitions and then talk more theoretically about what it means to think about undoing racism, exiting racism in this kind of decolonial moment. So what is racism? Well, there's a common dictionary definition of racism as an ideology based on the idea that race, which of course is a social construction, not biologically determined, not a biological concept, determines or can explain human traits and capacities, in that racial difference produces an inherent superiority of a particular quote-unquote race. And again, this is based on this amorphous, shifting definition of race, what Stuart Hall calls a floating signifier, that race sometimes is collapsed under, concepts of ethnicity, nationality, all manner of difference. I think a more useful definition of racism comes from our friend and colleague Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who says racism is the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And that means that the definition of racism is rooted in exactly what Professor Sithole talked about, in settler colonialism, in segregationism, in the continuation of apartheid. In other words, what's settler colonialism but the modern system whereby European colonists go to a place to extract resources and to stay, which means dispossessing or outright eliminating the indigenous population. But because modern settler societies were capitalist, driven by ideas about sovereignty, freedom, independence, it means that the process of dispossession required legitimizing settler sovereignty over both land and people. And not just by force, and not just by edict, but by liberal law. So settlers believed that their civil rights and the security of their own democratic institutions rested on the subjugation and subordination of indigenous peoples. And this is why a republic, like a Republic of South Africa, for example, and democratic principles can go hand in hand with repressive settler colonial policies of racism and exclusion. They're not, they're not contradictory. They actually work together. The problem of racism, therefore, in higher education is inseparable from the history of settler colonialism, which is an ongoing structure. It's not the past, it's the present. An ongoing structure that remains largely intact. And this, I hope, shouldn't surprise any of us. Of course, Steve Biko warned us about this, about creating a kind of rainbow society without fundamentally changing entrenched political, economic, social, and epistemic structures. When he wrote, if by integration you understand an assimilation and acceptance of blacks into an already established set of norms and code of behaviors set up by and maintained by whites, then yes, I'm against it. I'm against the superior inferior white black stratification that makes the white a perpetual teacher and the black a perpetual pupil, a poor one at that. I'm against the intellectual arrogance of white people that makes them believe that white leadership is a sine qua non in this country and that whites are the divinely appointed pace setters in progress. And I'm against the fact that a settler minority should impose an entire system of values on indigenous peoples. Now, of course, Steve Biko could have been talking about the United States of America without any without any revision. He could have been talking about Canada. He could be talking about Australia. He could be talking about basically any settler colony in the globe. Racism was foundational to liberalism. It was written into the constitutions and laws of every modern democracy because every modern democracy on the planet was founded as an ethno-national state. And that's just an absolute fact. In an effort to undo the kind of racist or ethno-national democracies in the post-colonial period, what we witness is the first stage of what Professor Sithole calls the liberal decoloniality, and that is in multiculturalism, diversity and inclusion. This is the language of racial liberalism from the 70s until now. The multiculturalism, clearly does not disrupt white supremacy, no matter what we believe. Liberal multiculturalism cannot dismantle white supremacy, nor was it intended to do that. We have to remember that diversity, inclusion, multiculturalism were concessions to anti-racist movements in South Africa that are trying to dismantle not just apartheid, but the entire structure of settler colonialism. There were concessions in the US and Canada to black movements for freedom and indigenous movements. Liberal multiculturalism co-opted or suppressed radical movements demanding the complete transformation of the social order and the eradication of all forms of racial, gender, sexual, and class hierarchies. And the point of liberal multiculturalism and the continuing point of liberal decoloniality in concepts like equity, diversity, inclusion was never, ever, ever to address the historical legacies of racism, dispossession, and injustice, but rather to bring some people into the fold of a society which we're told is no longer racially unjust. People may have bad attitudes, but the basic structure is being fixed. Now, what are those concessions? Well, the concessions are, at least here and elsewhere, black political figures, a black political class, elected officials, black university administrators, CEOs who help manage what has been the greatest transfer of wealth to the rich, even more rapidly than colonialism itself in many ways, and oversee the continued erosion of the welfare state, the displacement and deterioration of black communities, and wage war on the planet. Now, replacing multiculturalism has been post-racialism, which is, again, another manifestation of the kind of multiracial project. So no matter what we're told about post-racialism does not signal the end of race or racism, but rather a new modality of race and racism. a distinctive product of the neoliberal era. So post-raciality or colorblindness amounts to the claim that race no longer governs our lives. It has no explanatory value for inequality, for repression, for failure. And when you bring up race, it's because you're a racist. And this is the neoliberal presumption that race denies or shrouds individual responsibility. So racism can be reduced to individualized expression. So racism, and we see this, of course, dealing with police in the United States and elsewhere. Racism is ignorance. Racism is a bad joke. Racism are bad institutional actors in institutions that are fundamentally good. And this renders individuals solely accountable for their own actions and expressions, and by extension, removes responsibility from structural conditions or larger forces. And of course, with individualization comes racelessness, which of course is a myth. What's racelessness? It's not anti-racism or a commitment to ending all forms of racialized oppression, but it is the insistence, as David Theo Goldberg puts it, it's the insistence on racial erasure, thus rendering racially inspired or inflected injustices more difficult, even impossible to discern. Now, with the time I have left, which is not much, I just want to share a couple of examples of how this plays out here, like actually on my campus at UCLA. So in 1995, the year after the great miracle of 1994 in South Africa, here at UCLA, or the University of California system, the Board of Regents approved the banning of the use of race, religion, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin as criteria for admission to the university. That is the introduction of so-called colorblind admissions. And then a year later, we get the passage of what's called Proposition 209, which was drafted by a black man named Ward Connolly, which eliminated the use of affirmative action in college admissions. The result was black admissions at UCLA dropped in 1998 by 43%. And then by just a few years ago, we had like 96 black students, black freshmen, out of a class of 5,000. So it was just a dramatic drop. And meanwhile, as this is happening, resident tuition for in-state students at UCLA increased from $3,000 a year in 1990 to over $20,000 a year today. So you have this inverse relationship where now it's illegal to give so-called racialized groups fellowships and scholarships based on their status as racialized groups, but tuition increases. We also see egregious cases of faculty racism, which I won't go into, but I will say this much. There's so many examples of this, not just here, but all over the world. But I just want to say something about universities' response, because we see the replication of that response in South Africa and all over the globe. That is, whenever you have allegations of racism against faculty or staff, the university does three things. First, they avoid litigation by trying to pay a settlement and admitting no wrongdoing. Secondly, they create a task force to produce a report for which some task force to pay a lot of money to investigate racial climate on campus and whatnot. And then the third thing they do, and they did this here at UCLA around a particular case, they say, well, we need a new position. And they create a vice chancellor of equity, diversity, and inclusion who gets paid a six-figure salary to be the czar over race matters. And what's the result? Well, this czar over race matters is always subordinate to the vice chancellor for academic personnel, who decides like whether we're going to have faculty lines to hire more black faculty, who decides who's going to support the denial of tenure in departments where people are being denied basically because of the nature of their scholarship, which is a challenge, a kind of epistemic challenge to the kind of racism that's dominant in their field of discipline. And racism continues. Colleagues are driven away if they're not denied tenure. And then the so-called head of equity, diversity, inclusion has no power or wherewithal to address structural racism because that's not their job. Then, just last year, as Black faculty are diminishing, people dealing with racism, students are struggling, middle of a pandemic, George Floyd is killed. And the killing of George Floyd, not just here, but all over the globe, led universities to sort of scramble to do things like offer new faculty lines, provide some kind of support for Black scholars. But nothing changes. Nothing changes the academic structure of finance. Nothing changes the fact that we are trying to abolish campus police on this, at this campus and elsewhere, but that continues. Nothing changes in terms of, except for the fact that we have some more Black faculty being hired, appointed to leadership positions, who are willing to negotiate with and play ball with an administration that's not willing to make changes. And this is not a problem unique to the US, it's not unique to South Africa, but universities are no longer national institutions. They are global institutions. They're linked together by global networks. They serve the interests of global capital. They have been transformed by neoliberalism, which determines the racial character of all modern universities. And we're talking about administrators and trustees restructuring universities along corporate lines, promoting policies of austerity, privatization, profit, placing higher education under the discipline of market fundamentalism. The characteristics of this new order entail the casualization of labor. We could talk about faculty all day long and teaching staff, but think about the outsourcing of non-union labor in maintenance, in food services, in security, as tuitions are rising. All this is happening. The creeping privatization of public institutions. This is the reality we're facing. And that's the continuation of the structure of the settler colonial order that we're dealing. So in conclusion, there's no easy solutions, but there could be no solution without acknowledging that there is no rainbow, that racism is rampant in South African universities, throughout South African society, in all universities around the globe, everywhere around the world. There are always short-term things we can do, like holding anyone accountable who engages in racist behavior. All that stuff is important. Hiring more Black faculty and staff, paying people living wages, all that stuff is very important, temporary fixes, but they're temporary fixes. I think the conclusion is the conclusion that Professor Sithole mentioned, and it's also a version of the conclusion in Professor Motlong's thesis, which is you need an actual real decolonization. And decolonization is about overturning the kind of Eurocentrism of the academy, but it's more than that. It is, overturning the kind of epistemic coloniality, not just the dominance of European traditions, but really developing what she and others, call kind of pluriversal epistemology. But more importantly, it's about seeing decolonization not as a clever maneuver, a new syllabus, a new reading list, but a complete restructuring of the university and society itself. And right now, the neoliberal university is not prepared to do this. It isn't a matter of creating a better anti-racist police force, conceptually and otherwise, or gathering smart people in a room. It really requires a kind of radical rethinking and reordering. And sometimes it's messy. And so all the messiness of fees must fall and roads must fall is the kind of messiness that we need to pay attention to and actually follow, even if it doesn't look like the future we imagine for ourselves. Because all that language of diversity, inclusion, equity, excellence, all that needs to be thrown out to really rethink a kind of like, what is our future going to be as a planet? How do we create a kind of scholarship and intellectual engagement that could transform our lives. Because you can't have a university claiming to do the right thing when you've got millions of people who don't have a place to live. Those are related. You know, they're connected. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so very much, Professor Kelly, for those remarks. I think together with those from Professor Sitole, we have a lot to engage. And so at this time, we're going to have Ongezwe Mbele to respond to both of you at this time.
Good evening, everyone, and good morning to you in the US this morning. I think just the time that we have now is for us to really reflect on what has been said and what Prof. Sitole, and thank you very much for your words, says is we require fundamental change. And so the question then for me is, how is this fundamental change imagined, right? What language are we using to engage it? What we know now, that there's no rainbow, there are no born frees, because the young people who were born after 1994, they were called born frees. And then we had fees must fall, roads must fall, outsourcing must fall. So the young people, the youth of South Africa named the problem for us. The one that we've all been trying to avoid because of our colonial wound, what Frantz Fanon calls the woundedness of someone who's gone through colonization is physical and also psychological. So, and the imagination of a people relies on collective work. And it's a struggle, it's painful. What Prof. Kelly speaks about in terms of nothing has changed. You know, is time frozen? Is the knowledge that we produce is racist knowledge? So there's a call to account. What are we teaching? How are we teaching what we're teaching? When our students have spoken to us, are we even listening to them? Do we know their lived experiences? Do you know their clan names? Where they come from? There's knowledges that are already in place, but already are being ignored for whatever reason, right? I always say, for me, it's interesting how the Zulu greeting says, Sawubona. I see you. The people literally means I see you. I acknowledge your humanity. The people who you come with, who are alive and dead. So in that greeting, there's a call for love for humanity. And I'll go in when I'll go into the love for humanity, because it's Ngisi. Sometimes we wanna use English. Ne? When you talk about love in the Nguni language, isiZulu, is you go umthandazo, uthando. It's prayer and love are interlinked. That we need to meditate and think ourselves in a loving manner, because that's what's missing for me. There's a conversation to produce the knowledge. Who are we producing the knowledge for? Are we perpetuating? Are we holding the status quo? What Prof. Kelly and Prof. Sitole do beautifully, or is that there's this resistance for change. And if you're in an institution, you know what the resistance is. And each wherever you are in that structure, when you ask for change or you question, the resistance to change, you'll know what it is. You will know the diagnosis of it, but you will also know the feeling of it. And when we start shouting what drives us as human beings, which is feelings and thoughts, there's dehumanization. In a university structure, which is supposed to create knowledge and serve. So my imagination is the university are here to serve community. So the students that we are engaging with, how are they going to serve their communities? I have examples of my students who will say in discussion, my parents don't know even what I'm studying. They go, you're doing that thing of yours. And that's the dissonance. And that's the dissonance, because what we do is not connecting to their lived experience. And that's the sad part of this struggle. But then there's the hope, because I think we as human beings fool ourselves at times with the hope, so we can move. And so we can engage. So we're hoping for the future that is better. But are we really preparing for it? Prof. Salim Washington usually uses the word sankofa, meaning we must look back in order to propel forward. Is the history that we've been given and written for us enough for our humanity and our humanity project? How are we disrupting the histories? You know, in the US, there's a Christopher Columbus holiday, because Christopher Columbus discovered the US. And the US is progressive. So we think. In South Africa, we have Jan van Riebeeck discovering South Africa. What histories are we telling? And how are we telling those histories? And to even think that our students don't know their histories just from their lived experience, what stories do they have to tell? In terms of, there's always ways and methods of doing knowledge that goes beyond, and these days it's called indigenous knowledge systems, that goes beyond just the knowledge that we're doing with the papers and the written. Orality has always been a way of doing knowledge. And archiving with the body and passing on to a point that there's no dominance. Because the resistance, and we must name it, is you want to hold the hegemony. The power is comfortable and it's beautiful and seductive, but it's not transforming the human project, which is love. So that's my response. Uthando nomthandazo.
Thank you so much, Ongezwa, for those words. Not only provocative and profound, but beautiful as well. We thank you. We thank you. We have a number of questions. My question is, imagine if the three of you were in charge of UKZN. What would we do? What would you do? That would address the epistemic violence that is visited upon our student body in particular, but also our scholars. What roles does this this violence, this epistemic violence, play in the humanities, in the pedagogical approaches that we use with our students, even in our choice of language, right? Because coloniality in South Africa is rooted in language as well. Um, so I'm wondering what would be an intermediate step. Like Professor Kelly, I am most impressed by the student body that shut down the entire tertiary education system with the decolonial project. But one person in the question wants to know, Professor Kelly, why is it that Rose Must Fall may appear to be messy? And perhaps you can start us off with trying to answer this question in terms of how do we bridge between the kind of brilliant analyses that all three of you have given, and what could we do in a more prosaic sense uh, to protect our students from this violence? What can we do to provide a context for young academics to be able to thrive?
Well, let me just take the sort of sub question about why it's a messy. I don't know any revolutionary movement that's not messy. I mean, if it was not messy, then it wasn't a revolutionary movement, because part of what both Fees Must Fall and Both Must Fall, all those movements, which inspired the political insurgency by Black students in the United States, that was the source in 2015. They're trying to they have a critique, and then also trying to come up with a series of responses to that critique in a social movement where people are trying to figure out some common ground. There's questions of gender came up, questions of leadership, questions of popular education. So one of the amazing things of the many amazing things that came out of those movements, there was an effort, and this goes to the larger question that you're posing about what would we do, what would I do. Students had already developed forms of popular education. They developed their own reading list. A good example is Know Your Continent, the resurrection of Know Your Continent, which was a popular education project that emerged in Cape Town between students at University of Western Cape and University of Cape Town. And just one example, and that is that whatever we do, we've got to be able to trust our students to lead, as opposed to like saying, "Oh, well, no, that's not acceptable." No, we're the teachers. They're producing knowledge through lived experience and through their engagement of readings that they choose. And when you do that, you fundamentally shift. When Steve Biko talks about kind of white and black, we also have to think about shifting teacher pupil period. If we're all in the project of creating collective knowledge, then there's some basic things we need to do. We need to stop, grading students. Like, well, why do you have to have grades? I've given up the idea of, letter grades. I give everybody an A basically. Number one. Number two, I've gotten to the point where students are not required anymore in my classes to write individual papers. I'm like, you're going to be in a group, you write together. In your group, whatever your group does, that's going to be the project. And so by getting people to think collectively and to challenge the stuff that we think is so important, we've got to go with that. And I think that's the beginning. That's not like the answer, but to decolonize a university also means to decolonize the power relationships that are reproduced, where leaders who are then beholden to donors and to the state make determinations and decisions about policy, curricula, and students are supposed to be the consumers of those things. That makes no sense to me. And that's just, to me, the beginning. And the same messiness that these movements produce should be the messiness that invades our universities, so that we restructure them in a way that's more processual than just structural.
Thank you. Professor Zitole.
as Ongezwa was making, breaking down the concept of love in Nguni language, I was thinking of her name as well. I thought of the one who doesn't hear, like, sort of a rascal, but I was like, oh, the one who expands, like, the action. And in that fashion, I was thinking of the question of what is to be done. The problem of what is to be done will come if we want something clean. I'm very in favor of the concept of messiness, and it links logically to the question of imagination and the work that has been done by Professor Kelly. Freedom dreams, like to dream of freedom, it's a messy affair because of you are disrupting the status quo, right? But linked with this freedom dreams, it is the freedom drive. And I will call for the suspension of this clinginess that, oh, if we dream of this freedom and then we drive it, we are going to get a positive result. And I will call for us to meditate on failure, that failure in itself is a generative side, not only at the level of reflection, not at the level of doing differently, not at the level of doing better, but this like if one can generate love out of failure, can you really imagine what will transpire? It won't be a matter of correcting an error but it will be something that will generate a critical attitude. And pedagogically, as I'm thinking of what will we do, I mean, what feet must fall, roads must fall did. It's something new. For the first time in the post-1994 history, we know that the language of SARS code has been about, oh, decrease the fees, we want bashes, blah, blah, blah. But, and the university management has been using these structures for the, as a proxy for their office politics. But for the first time, we saw the call for the curriculum, right? Change, not in a cosmetic way of, or include black authors, blah, 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 but like how this language, this new grammar comes into being. And this links with what the response that you raised, Ongezwa, and I had a very important word, and even from Professor Kelly, which is called to serve. What is it to serve? Of course, like it's a seductive concept. It is so innocent and benevolent. But I will argue that to serve it's a very dangerous concept. That to serve is to give, and to serve is to live for, right? And without expecting anything. And to serve is to be selfless with oneself. And to serve is to be in relation. And if we can think about this concept of serving, it links with what the concept of preparation. I often tell my students that we must apply the law of preparation, which means that you will do something without being expected, without expecting particular results, right? That I will work with, I will work for, I will work on, I will work in, I will work by, and I will work through. That's preparation. And you see the radicality of this concept that we take love. And I'm now like having to revise the paper that I'm writing, where like I was examining the phenomenology of love as it has been coined by Maduro Torres, right? And what you said, umtandazo and utando, it's not a semantic affair, right? But it is a meditation that you don't see the relation between concepts, but how are they fusing? How are they stretching one another? So if we were to be put in that position with the students as the leaders and the vanguard of this change, it will mean that if there is failure, this failure will not mean everything coming to a halt, but this failure will mean this beginning of something, right? I remember Professor Washington. I made a joke to him that when you're blowing your horn, you were flying, and Zuzo Makatini was there, and he said, it was like, no, he was wearing Easter chic, and then I watched the stage. His feet did not touch the ground. And then Makatini said, well, at that time, the witch fell as I was playing my piano and stomping the ground. So there is this side of knowledge, and what was said beautifully about the issue of the popular education, where in which you will take something that is not regarded as a text. For example, the poster, like if one can do a study of posters during fallism, there's a lot of episteme there, right? There are a lot of archives. We listen to music, we listen to like everything that is out there. It is knowledge, and this is where I'm thinking seriously about the issue of saving, the issue of preparing, and the issue of love. As you see, like now, I'm in Tembisa. I've been frequenting some shebins over the weekend, which were closed, and I was shocked about the political engagement that was happening. And this study, of course, will not go on up until things are. But the things that I'm picking up, I'm linking this with what was happening in the township shebins in the 50s, where it was now 50 communities coming together, that people are not there only to drink, but to engage critically. And this is where knowledge is. Yeah, so I will stop there for now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sitole. Um, so, Brother Angelo has asked a question about how do we utilize materials to make our teaching or our education more relevant to the lived experiences of our student bodies. So I guess I want to uh, also shape that question by the fact that all of you, Ongezwa, Tendai, and Robin, have tied the problems within the academy to the historical and social realities of the societies, of the globe, actually, in terms of racist structures in their history and colonialism and patriarchy and other evils. So, with respect to that, many of our students are here not necessarily only for epistemological engagement, but because they come from impoverished backgrounds and they want to skip over a certain amount of drudgery in the way that their parents and their grandparents and their great grandparents have suffered. So, what do we do for a student body that, to a significant extent, come from secondary schools that have not prepared them? Although Professor Kelly is interrogating the notion of what preparedness means and what achievement means in the academic context. But in South Africa, we have so many people who are here, so that they can graduate and get that 4,000, 5,000 a month and start paying back black tax, as it's called. So I wonder, how do we address that? And then the other end of the question is, how do we address, because you all have given us some brilliant ideas about what to do, but how do we address the reticence around the issue of racism that is not peculiar to South Africa, but it has a real special virulent strain where people do not want to acknowledge things. And this happens in the academy as well. So on the one hand, we want to look at Angelo's question about the lived experiences, but I'm also adding to that, how do we confront the reticence that we face as we try to do these things? And on Gabriel, if you would like to join in these questions, that would be most welcome. Can I start again with you, Professor Kelly?
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to think through those. Those are really excellent questions. And in fact, I think that both Professor Mbele and Professor Sithole has begun to actually address these questions with the two themes of to serve and love. And let me just go back to the first part of the question, which is like, one, what materials do we use? How do we actually teach, especially those students who are maybe first generation college students who really need to basically make a livelihood? I'm responsible, and many of us, in fact, on this call are responsible for ruining dreams of students who wanted to get a corporate job and they end up becoming like lifetime organizers. I mean, that's what happens. Even those students who we think who are coming from backgrounds who, this is an opportunity for upward mobility, many of them actually don't take that route. It's amazing how many move into directions because of the kind of broad-based liberal arts education they could get in the context of struggle, that they end up throwing the lot in, with movements and with really insurgent kinds of activities. And that's not everyone, but that's more than I think we imagine. And with that, I mean, there's three things I kind of think about. One is to serve and to love is to not see fellow students as your competitors. The university structure, K through 12 is structured that way, where everyone's trying to get to the next stage, and you're competing. But if someone comes into university without the kinds of quote unquote skills you need to basically write an academic paper, what does it mean to work on a project together with others, to produce something collectively where people's strengths come in and they learn in the process to teach each other? So to make it more and more collaborative, we'll be able to not just erase those kinds of distinctions, but highlight one's particular skills, develop new skills, and more importantly, serve. You're now serving the interests of other students, in the interests of the classroom, in the interests of production of knowledge. You're now loving in the sense of agape, that is, the constant struggle to create community by any means, even with people you may not like at first. So to me, that experience of production of knowledge is way more important than the outcome. And the fact that we're saddled with this neoliberal language at the university, which is international, the language of outcomes, that we're supposed to have an outcome, as if somehow there's a product on the other end. And I got students who talk like that. They actually have imbibed the language. I'm like, no. And they talk about stuff like protecting their brand and, making sure that they, that they could produce something, not produce an experience. And so we have to really rethink all that stuff. And that means, to go back to Tendaye's point about materials, Why do we always use texts? What's a text anyway? Can a text be a poster, a photograph? Can a text be a memory? Imagine some of the best projects I've ever done, two projects. One is having my students in my African American history courses and other courses interview people in their community, interview their families, and produce a kind of oral history of a moment, whether that moment is, the 50s and 60s, whether that moment is the 1930s. Produce these oral histories and collectively put them together on a website. The other thing is that the text in a lot of my courses are social movements themselves. So what students are required to do, I've been doing this for 25 years, they have to choose an existing organization and go reach out to those people, not by email, but actually talk to people and create a website for the organization. That is to say, figure out what's their agenda, what are they trying to do, and then connect all these websites together to create a web network of movements to basically prove that movements are not in the past, that there are people who are serving each other and serving the people right now. What do they look like? Where do they come from? Who are those people? That is production of new knowledge. And that's way better than any book I've ever written, I have to say. But those are the kinds of strategies that I think that allow us to not just engage our students and learn from them, but for them to engage each other and engage a larger community, which then breaks down the inside-outside Ivy Wall distinction, which is a false one, except for the fact that one exercises more power than the other.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Sithole, we have a question from our own Professor Professor Zulu, who says, I've been trying to find a simpler definition of decoloniality for myself. It seems to start from working against coloniality. Can that also be the practical reality part of it, of living it? He asked.
Yes. No, indeed, I know that Prof. Zulu, you are departing from the position that decoloniality is a populist project, and I'm awaiting for your final paper, which I have a privilege to read, and I will respond accordingly as well. Indeed, in terms of the real politic, if we can look at the real politic in terms of the means to an end, we are going to miss out a lot in terms of what decoloniality offers as a different way of thinking, a different doing. But when I'm saying, yes, decoloniality is not, yes, decoloniality it's a continued project. It is not what offers a template development to say we are critiquing coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of being, and also having of gender and so forth. But there is a rich concept that that answers the important question that Professor uh, Paulo Zulu is posing, which is the decolonial. What is saying, oh, this is a 10, and then it is definitive. It's a continued deepening of a dialectic, if like one might put it, and that it shows that it comes from different genealogies and constellations of thought. And there has been a criticism that decoloniality comes from Latin America, and we know that that is false, right? Even though thinkers like Steve Biko, Robert Sobuka did not use the word, but their practice in the real politic, right? And I'm making reference to these two thinkers because of they were engaged in the real politic, which means them confronting and combating the hyper legislative apartheid state. And they made sure that they are producing different forms of knowing, doing, and thinking, even though Black consciousness was banned. But there are like some of us who have taken a baton. So it's a continued and radical project.
Okay. I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Would either of you like to tackle the question about the virulence of denying race, and also the kind of shocking racial outbursts that happen here in South Africa as a kind of daily occurrence, a quotidian type of occurrence? The United States is clearly one of the most racist countries in the history of mankind, of womankind. And yet things are said here routinely that would never be said there without inviting perhaps physical retribution. So we have a case here at the at UKZN, at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where people feel empowered to do and say the most awful things, to disrespect Black intelligence, to not engage their students critically, to call them names, and even scholars and colleagues are subjected to this on occasion. So I'm not saying it's unique. I'm just saying it's staggering how pervasive it is in our culture here. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, either of you.
I'll just, I think with South Africa, the reality is we went to the rainbow before we actually did the work. And we saw the rainbow, we're the rainbow nation, and the realities were the fact that the transition to a democratic South Africa was a violent one. And we have not had a chance to actually name and engage that even transition of violence, right? If you grew up in the townships of KwaMashu, your memory as a child, and you in the transition of post-1994, a memory of a child has violent images. You are socialized with violence. And when that narration is told to us, it's when we are told that history, it's the IFP and the ANC fight. But what you experienced was not that.
Mm.
So, and this is what plays out in the university structure, I think, is a people that haven't had a chance to really engage, to really have dialogue that is truthful. And the truth, Inyani is very painful. So when I mean truth, I don't mean, oh, it must feel good. When we really engage on who we come from and where we're going and how we became, right?
Yes.
And
Thank you.
at the heart of it, for me, it's that. And it's painful. I mean, to reflect at this point, when Prof. Hlongwa said to me, Onks, do you mind responding? I had to take time out a bit. I said, I'll come back to you. I just need to pray. I need to do what my grandmother, Omakulu, did in order for me to survive and come into this institution, right? We know that there's a movement. I'm not here by chance. I am here because of the prayers of my grandmothers and Notatomkulu. And that's a movement in itself. And to choose that grace, Black people have grace. Because it's my sister, no meaning. We can take it on anytime. We have a choice. But we know what is at stake. Because the future of our children is at stake. And the future of our students is at stake. And so it's that grace that gets misread as if that I'm just, you can take me on anytime.
Yes. Yes. That is a beautiful answer. I have noticed that the grace of Black people is very, very profound this side. Do we need to sacrifice that, Ongezwa?
There's also
You're
rape,
not suggesting.
which came out
I'm
just,
sorry?
in my passion. I'm saying there's race. It's messy, right? It's
It's
messy.
messy. It's messy. It's messy. But okay, it's messy. I think we can let you have the last word um, at this section of the webinar, and that we can go to Prof. Slungwa for the vote of thanks. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Washington, for the excellent facilitation of this first of our webinar series on transformation in the College of Humanities here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. We're very, very grateful. I will begin by thanking Prof. Mkhize and Nhlanhla Mkhize, our DVC and the head of Humanities College. This series, this transformation series, are his brainchild. Since joining the College of Humanities, Prof. Mkhize has been very, very innovative. Issues of transformation are key to his project in terms of his work as our leader for the College of Humanities. So we're very grateful to him, to his excellent leadership that he has shown up to now. I do want to first thank Prof. Stoll, Jobe. Thank you very much. So I think it's just not for the first time that we will just be engaging you on this subject. We will continue and have maybe an entire day or 2 days workshop on this important subject, of which I think as an outcome, we would like to see a book which will come as a result of that engagement moving forward. Thank you very, very much, Prof. Stolle, for engaging us. I also want to engage and also thank Prof. Robin Kelly. Thank you very much, all the way from Los Angeles. Thank you so much. I know it's in the morning there, and we invited you and you accepted the call. Thank you so much for sharing your insight into racism and what we're experiencing in our current universities. I think we have learned a lot. We are going to take so much based on what you have shared with us in terms of addressing issues of our curriculum in our universities. Because yes, we definitely need to rethink and revisit what it is that we are teaching, especially in light of the changes in demographics. If you go and visit South African universities, especially UKZN, which is a university which is in a rural kind of most of the students that we get are students from deep rural areas. That's who we attract. We have increased those numbers. We've massified education, higher education. But in that massification, how are we understanding how these students learn? It's critical to our project of decolonization. So thank you very much, Prof, for engaging and for engaging us in this important dialogue. And Ongezwa, our young lion. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ongezwa. Your critical response. It's amazing hearing you talking about the word uthando and umthandazo. You know, as you were mentioning that, and then I came up with the personal name, Nomthandazo, mother of prayer, which are the names that are given to us by our parents, because they wish that like we continue to do the prayer. Imthandazo yabomakhulu yabogogo bethu, that has put us into these places that we are in. They continue to nurture us to be the people that we are. Thank you very, very much, Ongezwa, for accepting to be a respondent in this webinar today. You are going to grow, and I'm certain about that. Like with the number of projects that you are already involved in as a young scholar, I see a bright future in you, Ongezwa. Thank you very much. To everybody who is in attendance this evening, thank you very much for your time. We will continue with this conversation. It is not gonna end here. The struggle continues, and in so doing, Prof. Mkize will say this: during colonialism, our African languages, our knowledge systems were undermined. They had to go underground. Recognition of IKS, that's the important project moving forward. So for us, in order to contribute to the knowledge project, in order to contribute to the current university that we want, the university we want, that will acknowledge our communities, that will acknowledge those people who are there in the grassroots, we need to engage, continue to engage in this important subject. So with those words, thank you very much. We will continue and contact you so that like we plan a longer workshop, and we'll want to have an outcome of that workshop in the form of a book. Within the College of Humanities, we have in an institute, a humanities institute, and we have begun a book series. In 2020, we published quite a lot of books within the College of Humanities, and the book that like you come up with, it will fall under those a series of books that we are engaging in, because like we want to contribute to the knowledge within the humanities and social sciences. With those few words then, I would like to thank you very, very much for your time and engaging all of us. And also acknowledging our students and I don't know how I could thank our students. The roads must fall, the fees must fall. They have spoken, so we must listen. Thank you very much.